Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to you, and thanks for joining us tonight. I think this will be a very informative presentation. My name is Rich Ailes, and I'm a member of the Working Group on Aging Concerns of Concord Quarter. Our working group has been around since 2017. We have members from all of the meetings in our quarter coming to usually our monthly meetings. And we've made several presentations on aging concerns like aging in place, downsizing, hospice, those kinds of things. So tonight's presentation is another one of our presentations on aging concerns. This is the second part of a two-part series. Last week, we did a presentation on human body donation and organ donation and human composting. And if you registered for that event, you'll receive a link in your email when we post it so that you can view it then. So tonight we have Matthew Genereux. Is that it, Matthew?
That is correct, yes.
Genereux, okay. I'm not even French, so there. So Matthew is the director of the Longwood Funeral Home in Kennett Square, and he's been doing this for 30 years. He has a degree from the University of Delaware and Cantonville Mortuary School, where he earned his degree in funeral service proficiency, enabling him to become a licensed funeral director with federal jurisdiction. I'm not sure what that means, but that means that it can help in funeral homes throughout the nation. So we had Matthew come and talk to our small group a couple of months ago about green burials, and we were so impressed with that presentation that we asked him to come back and do this. And what Matthew's presentation is going to cover is, I guess, 4 topics. Oh, first one is what actually happens at death. I don't think any of us are really certain what to do if our partner died, what the protocol would be, who would take care of the body and that sort of thing. And also, Matthew's going to go into traditional burial, cremation, and green burials, all of which he does at his funeral home. And by the way, there will be a resource page at our webpage on this event. And on that resource page, you'll have the link to the Longwood Funeral Service. I think, let's see. I think that's about it. Matthew, you have a slide presentation. The slide's right up there on the screen. We can get started.
Hope you can all see that. Well, good evening. Thanks for asking me to present again. It was enjoyable last time, and I think it's just a good, thorough information. I've had the opportunity to speak at many groups, also over at Kendall and Crosslands here in Kennett Square in their auditorium with the same program. And I try to keep it light. You have to keep this light in the topic that it is. But I think it's great that it's so much more direct today than it was a generation ago. And I think why is it so important is because it's likely that you and your partner will pass away, and your kids may not even be in the same town as you. This generational change is becoming more and more of the norm. So I'll piggyback on what Rich said a minute ago. What happens after death? And I get the call frequently, or someone knocking on the door that either mom or dad is at home, and what do I do if I find them? Or mom and dad are in hospice, or what do I do? Or they're in assisted living. There's a lot of different criteria of what to be done if in fact someone has passed away and you find them, or if it's expected death. So what we're seeing so much more now today is the advancement and really the push of hospice care, which is a great form of healthcare and assistance at the end of someone's anticipated demise. And when hospice is called in, that protocol of nurse practitioners and social workers and aides help those families take care of that patient And when that time comes and the person passes away and hospice is not present, that's when they're calling that hospice group first, because they come out to the house or to the apartment or to the assisted living and they do that formal pronouncement. And that just simply means that it's a legal passing. The person has been declared deceased. There was a treatment for that person. There was a diagnosis for that person. And then now it's the end of that person's life on this particular date and time. And then they turn to the family and say, do you have a funeral home that is going to come to the home, the apartment, or the assisted living to transfer them back to the funeral home for your wish and desire of disposition? That's when we're engaged for the first time. That's a very expected and a very planned thing, because hospice today is very aggressive with saying, even on the onset of their treatment, do you have a funeral home, so you're not caught off guard at 3 o'clock in the morning. And it's all about custody of the remains, who's taking care of the remains through this whole kind of process. The second scenario is that, you pass away in an institution or a hospital. That has been, a generation after generation location for passing. So it's so administratively done. If you witness someone passing away at a hospital, you leave the room and then the body is moved to another location and then the funeral home is called and then they're dispatched to go to the hospital. It's just it's still procedural how all those things are done from a hospital institution for years. The third is, and many people have experienced this, is unexpected death. Whether someone finds someone that doesn't wake up in the morning that we can all just hope for, and a person is found to be deceased and they're not under the care of a doctor, the protocol is you have to call 911. 911 because paramedics come to the house unless there's an active DNR for that person, a do not resuscitate order. They have to make an attempt to resuscitate. If it's apparent death, and I use that term really clearly, if it's apparently that they've been deceased for a while, then that engagement doesn't happen. But we've all heard the story of they have a DNR and mom or dad just collapsed. They, under the legal restriction, have to try to resuscitate. That's why I'm saying directives from the funeral home, directives from people, from your doctors, from your family are so important to say, I don't want this if you happen to find me, or please do not do this, or please call the funeral home and just let me have a natural demise. So there's kind of three ways to how we're kind of engaged in that sense. The latter one is, when someone is deceased from the house and it's, the person has been in decline and their partner has been taking care of them, likely the person is going to be released from the house. Meaning after the paramedics get there, the police are there, the coroner is called, the family doctor is called. Most family doctors are just decent today still. They'll say, we'll sign the death certificate for Mr. Smith. That's not a problem. Go ahead and call the funeral home. That's, again, when we're engaged to come out, regardless of what time of day it is. That is our business, a 24-hour night and day type on-call service business. And then we come out to the house and make that transfer directly. So they're kind of like the three things that happens, right at death and what needs to be done. This was presented to me about 15 years ago from the folks over at Kendall and Crosslands, and I really thought about how to kind of present this in a sense of everyone needs to think about it. Many of your parents and grandparents thought, well, we never call the undertaker until we need them. And I just think that is, that is kind of a selfish act today, because with kids and grandkids not living around the corner, you should have a plan. And I still sit across from people, they've been married 40, 50, 60 years, and they're still going to tell me to my face that they've never talked about it with their spouse. And I just find it amazing that they've never engaged in this conversation of what to do with the other. And I facetiously start saying, you cannot say my wife will take care of it. That's not an appropriate response to how to think about what we're going to do. We talk about, what's traditional today and what the community is really asking for when it comes to funeral services. I don't think anything is really traditional anymore. And I say the word traditional, like think of your parents and grandparents. Most likely Many or most of them were buried in the ground in caskets because that was just that time and place. I think, again, because of the transient society today, we just see less and less of that. It is certainly about cost, absolutely. It's also about, the ecology, what's involved with the environmental impact of all of this. What are we doing? Um, they all of these dispositions have value. I don't minimize the value of what each one has or provides. And I tend to use the words to families, what do you need? Not what do you want, but what do you really need in all of this? And I think that's a good segue to kind of talk about, do we have traditional burial or do we have graveside services of a body where your body is simply transferred from the place of death to the funeral home? It's prepared in some fashion, whether it's prepared for a viewing or whether it's just prepared for direct burial, but your body is actually going to be placed in another encasement and then placed into the ground. We talk about direct cremation. And, and again, that description of services have changed so much over the years because of society. There's less and less, I think, direct cremation. I say it redundantly because someone will always kind of want to see someone. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily prepared in a casket, cosmetized, and in the funeral home, but they just may want to see them before cremation takes place. So then you have, cremation or private viewing before cremation. We saw a lot of this, sadly, after COVID and during COVID because nobody could get to town and they couldn't even get into the facilities to see mom or dad. And so this became the place where they sadly had to say their goodbye. But it didn't change their view of what they wanted, meaning they didn't pivot and say all of a sudden they want ground burial. No, they still wanted cremation, but they wanted a chance to at least see the person. And again, it doesn't have to be like formal preparation of your body. It could just simply be the sheet is pulled up to their chin, your head is on a pillow, your eyes are closed, and someone can come in and say their goodbyes in kind of a quiet manner. The third method of disposition, I know you kind of piggybacked on it last week, and this has been more of a regional thing here to Southeast Pennsylvania, is anatomical body donation to science. The Humanities Gift Registry in Pennsylvania has been a wonderful group for many, many years. And I really spoke about this in great detail years ago about the process and how important it is to understand that process if you want to donate your bodies to science. Things changed in Pennsylvania, particularly in the Southeast the last few years, because there is no more indigent burial service in the state, meaning there is not an indigent burial account where funeral homes can take care of indigents that do not, have no means to do so. They're simply cremated by the state. The same with people to say, I just want to donate my body to science. Well, you have to register to donate your body to science. We can't do that at the time of. We've also found out that the registry has had an abundance of human remains, whether they're homeless, whether they're indigent, whether they're prisoners, and their criteria has changed and their need for bodies have changed. So when people come and prearrange and say, I just want to donate my body to science, or I was a physician for years at Penn, I'm a big believer in saying you should really line these things up ahead of time with Penn, with the physician, with the protocol you're in. If you have a brain-related disease, because we can't really do much at the time of, because conditions have to be presented properly for your body to be donated where you're useful. It's almost you're too young and you're too old in life too. The anatomical body registry really does desire the really young and the really old. And I mean really old, not 85 and 90 is no longer the old, which is so interesting. So that's something that I've seen a lot of denials come through the Humanities Gift Registry, where people have been registered. And then at the time of, we'll let them know Mr. Smith died. He's 85 years old. He died of congestive heart failure. And many more times, honestly, since COVID, I've heard we're not in the need right now. That's kind of their decline. So what are we doing for step two then? If step one can't be honored, then what's your number two? Most of the time, what we hear is green burial or cremation, because at least they know that their body is being used for something, as in green burial, as you kind of chatted about last week, um, or they just want direct disposition of direct cremation and ashes spread somewhere that they can be honored. So that's kind of, the four different methods of, and with the green burial too, you can also add into that the kind of the new wave of composting that I know you chatted about last week that I won't reiterate, but that is still, I think, having a lot of wheels behind that methodology of disposition, especially if you're a gardener, especially if you just want to really know you're giving back. Um, in the sense of, as in green burial sites, the composting can be done on your own property afterwards. So I think that's kind of unique. Um, we go into the first, and I think the scene in the pictorial is just everything that many of us grew up with. The casket at the grave site, for whether we had a viewing with a funeral service, at a church or a funeral home location, followed by interment of the body at the family grave site or the interment site. Or we talk about direct graveside burial, where we may not necessarily have a viewing. We may not necessarily have any funeral rites or ceremonies at a church or the funeral home. The person just wishes to be buried in the ground, in a casket, at their location, with just a welcome in there at their site. This part is where I seem to be more and more explaining to the public about what cremation is, not the process of cremation. But a generation ago, and I've been doing this 31 years now, I learned from great World War I and World War II guys, but they were classic undertakers. They stood behind the big desk, they filled out the 4 or 5 forms, and they brought you into the other room to pick out a casket. It was just that. It was funeral service. I mean, honestly, from up until the early 80s, I think that's how a lot of it was. And on the East Coast, we were about 75 to 85% burial in a casket at that point. When I began my career in funeral service, we were less than 5% cremation. I just can't even think about it now. I do taunt my apprentices quite a bit, saying, you don't know what it's like to work, because we were embalming and preparing 95% of the bodies at that point. And preparation of bodies is much different than preparing them from cremation. But when people just say, I just want a cremation today, I really kind of take that as, okay, do you mean no one wants to see the person? There is no need for a viewing? Oh, no, we want to have a viewing, but we're going to have cremation. Okay, well, that's not direct cremation. So we talk about direct cremation where there's no viewing, no funeral service, no gathering, no private identification, and we're just transferring the body from the place of death back to our funeral home. You're placed in refrigeration. Embalming is not required. A casket is not required. And then when the permits are retained from the appropriate authorities, then cremation takes place. I have that pictorial up because it kind of shows two methods to this. On the right-hand side is what we do quite often. I mean, that has become, to me, if I had to define what traditional is today in 2025 in this region of the country, it is having a viewing followed by cremation. It's no longer having a viewing followed by ground burial of a casket. So we still have a viewing. You're still placed in a casket. The casket is not cremated. That's a far stretch on the left where I say, be aware of funeral homes that try to sell you caskets to be cremated, because that's not required. It may be their requirement, but it's not a federal requirement. It's not a state requirement. It is their revenue requirement is what they're trying to push that narrative as. On the right-hand side, many colleagues are using this kind of idea or method where you see an insert inside of a casket, a traditional wood or metal casket. And the reason for this we see so much more of, because not necessarily we're doing something at the funeral home, but we may be taking the person to their church they belong to for 50, 60, 70 years. We may be taking them to the fire hall or a location or another place for a funeral service, and then they're brought back to the funeral home, and then only that corrugated container is cremated with the remains. So we're very conscientious. I'm very conscientious of that because learning and being involved with the Kennett meeting ground burial up here in Kennett Square, and what really fosters a true green burial, and learning about the true carbon footprint of cremation versus ground burial, it has been astounding. I mean, the most natural in the world is green burial, placed in the ground in a container, no glue, no metal, no plastic, no um, formaldehyde-based fluids within your bodies, to be placed in a shroud in the ground. That's the most ecological way for disposition. If people knew the cubic centimeters of gas that have to be used for the crematorium itself, the building and facility that I had to erect for the crematory to hold, I mean, the carbon footprint is real. So I just always say, well, ecologically, green burial is number one. There's no doubt about it. There's no doubt that cremation is, and I use the word respectfully, it's just very tidy. Everything is kind of taken care of. The body's taken care of. The remains can be divided. They can be scattered. They can be buried. They could be disposed of in any which way. They're not pathological. They don't impact the environment. And I say in the words, like, it's practical. Cremation is a practical method of disposition. We talked about, and I know you chatted about this last week, but for our region, this is kind of important because this is how the Humanities Gift Registry works here, is there's two methods of return, if you will. Some people just say, mom wanted her body donated to science. We don't want her ashes back. And sometimes I ask, okay, I'll ask that question again once they're done with you, but you're telling me that mom wants direct disposition, donation to science, and after she is used for those medical purposes, you do not want her ashes back. And people either say yes or no, or ask me when that time comes. Most families that we serve do want the ashes back, but then I explain to them it could be up to 2 years for the Humanities Gift Registry in our region. I know all registries operate differently. But in this area, within about 2 years, we have the remains back, and either cremation takes place here or it's taken place at the registry. It really depends upon their workload and our workload and what we may be doing next. We may be doing a ground burial of that body afterwards, or we've even had a green burial of a body that went to Humanities Gift Registry for 2 years. So those are the things that we talk about in great detail when people just kind of give me the vague overview of what they want, for them to try to make some decisions. And then finally is the green burial or body of ashes and the cemetery options. And I don't ever, I think some of the marketing out there tends to be above and beyond and not always completely truthful of the information. There are some regional cemeteries that are now offering green burial. And once we start to get information about some of them, I start to ask the question, well, do they require a burial vault? And about 80% of them come back and say, well, we do require a burial vault, but the body can just be placed in the burial vault. Well, that's not a green burial. The green burial simply means that the body is shrouded or encased in something that is completely biodegradable, with no glue, no buttons, no metal, no plastic, no formaldehyde, no injection. And then the other question is, well, we have a beautiful green burial section where you can have a headstone. It can be upright. It can be flush. You can have a bench. It's a beautifully manicured area. Well, that's not necessarily a green burial section either. The true green burial sections are those areas that do not require a concrete burial vault, that don't necessarily approve of any sort of marker or monument other than something very subtle without a concrete foundation that supports it. Most of it are overgrown, manicured and manicured garden areas where specific species of flowers and shrubs and trees are grown for that particular reason. The encasements are just that are completely natural and not toxic. And I think that's just, so important in the sense of keeping that consistent. Because if it's not, then why are they permitted to call it a green burial section? I also describe about how there are so many different lanes of this profession and what we do. There's what we do as a funeral home and taking remains into our care, how we prepare them, what our funeral services are kind of all about, and then we have to work with, and I'll softly say deal with, cemeteries and their regulations and their above and beyond charges of what they require, which is mostly revenue based, and then trying to be the middle person and explaining to a family, this is what you need and this is what you really don't need. And be honest with them, saying, and particularly in green burial, here's a cemetery that has a section within their cemetery. They're calling it green. They're $3,000 grave sites, and you're allowed to put a headstone. And I'll let you have the information of making the decision of whether you think it's green or whether you think it's worth it. But to give families the true options of what these costs are, but also that the processes are. And I totally understand that everybody's entitled to make a living, but unfortunately, and we've all heard discussions about cemeteries and funeral homes and their revenue streams and how they, cemeteries are there to sell plots. They're there to sell green burial sections. They're there to sell headstones. But they may not be conveying the most accurate information when it comes to what you really need for disposition and what you don't need for disposition. With cremation, and whether it's disposition of a body, of a casket, green burial, or ashes, I always get very specific with families about, we really need to understand what your cemetery is going to allow and what you need and what you don't need. And this is what's really pivoted during my time here, is the days of the 12 grave plots that all of our parents and grandparents may have had, we're likely not going into. So we're seeing a lot of first purchases, at least here in my region, first purchases because they're not going back to their hometown. So they'll say, well, Matt, my husband wants to be cremated. I want to be buried. We're going to go get a 2 grave plot. And that's when I put on the brakes. I'm like, well, you don't need a 2 grave plot for that. So the cemetery will sell you a 2 grave plot, but you don't need that. You simply only need a single grave plot if your husband chooses to be buried and you're to be cremated, because your ashes could be on top of his. So there's a lot of things that I think when people slow down and really kind of absorb and prearrange and pre-plan and really think about this, like they do all their other directives, their health directives, their legal directives. Think about this directive. Where am I going and what do I really need and not need? And I think that's kind of a good segue of how as I keep reiterating it. I hope you can forward this PowerPoint on to anyone that's interested, because it kind of goes through the values of the Green Burial Council. And I won't kind of go into that into great detail, but it's their standards, if you will, of how funeral homes need to be presenting this information to client families, of what it means to be prepared or not prepared, what it means to be encased in something that's biodegradable versus encased in something that's metal or concrete or wood, the depths of how we bury remains at certain levels at grave sites, what the location usually looks like afterwards, whether it's a headstone or just something very simplistic, how the grounds are going to be manicured after the closing of the grave occur, what that cemetery's plan is for replantings and composting at the year end, and how they what their long-term horticulture plan is for that grounds. They're all the things that the deed holders, the people, should be involved with, and I think that's so important. Again, I think there's a myth too about prearranging and prepaying funerals. the 80s and 90s, especially when I got into this business, there was this huge push by a lot of owners to prepay, prepay, prepay. Um, as I saw a lot of contracts come to fruition when people passed away, when I was working for other funeral homes 20 years ago, um, it was very successful on both the funeral home side and the consumer side at that point to prepay, particularly when it came to ground burial of services, caskets, burial vaults, cemetery lots, traditional services, because those are the things that have really been affected by inflation over the years. Go to the grocery store. That's the best way I explain it, how much things have increased. Our costs have increased significantly the last 5 years, about 15 to 18% on the ground burial side, and about 5 to 9% on the cremation side. That's no different than most households of the same things that you purchase on a daily basis. In the 80s and 90s, it was so important, but you got to understand the interest rates were 8, 9%. So these insurance policies and these prepaid policies really did cover inflation. So when mom or dad or grandma or grandpa died, it covered everything in the funeral bill and then some. Today, where we have less services involved, there's less involvement of merchandise, of tangible things that we've seen increase so much. I typically say you don't need to prepay unless one, you absolutely want to. And I can understand that. Some families come in and say, I don't want my kids to deal with this. I just want everything in an account. The account will be set up in the person's name and their social security number. It's not our money. It's not in our general account. Some funeral homes are holding their own monies and still write their own insurance. I never believed it personally. If I should sell or my kids don't want this, it's your money in your bank. And I've seen enough funeral homes change in the region and have been the benefactor of those transfers that have come here because they don't want to continue their arrangements elsewhere. I think pre-arrangement of ideas is essential. I'm at 53. I've had to unfortunately bury enough friends at this point and enough children of my friends. At least you got to know what needs to be done and what the wish is. I keep going back, you're too young and you're too old. When all my friends, you just can't say just cremate me or just have a picnic or just have a barbecue. And then who needs to know this? Well, your partner needs to know this. Most kids don't want to hear it. I get it. They don't want to ever think their parents are going to pass away. But I think it's so important, especially when your kids grow up, get out of college, leave the house, that's when the discussion I think needs to happen, because that's when usually the surprise of life could happen to you or your partner. What are we going to do with you, and who needs to know? And I say it because society is great and about the DNR has become such a big part of life after 50. Getting your will together, getting all of your financial directives in order, whether you start downsizing in your early 50s or mid 50s, you should at least be making some sort of decision about what we're going to do with you. And at least have those written down somewhere. And many of the older traditional last wills and testaments had those codicils in them. I, Matthew Genereux, wish to be buried in Longwood Cemetery next to my parents upon my demise, or I wish to be cremated. So many attorneys, and I'm seeing less and less of it, as many wills as I've seen, I'm seeing less and less of it, of newer wills that are being issued and certified and signed, that it's not in there. And if I have a chance to talk to a family about it, I really press that, because it, one, makes it very clear. Two, it takes the decision making out of, God forbid, have your kids have to make this decision in their 20s or 30s. And so when you're setting everything up and you're selling the house and you're getting ready to go to an awesome community in your 50s or 60s, this should be on the checklist. Or at least we need to revisit the list. And then you can always change. And I think that's important too. So, then you kind of go back again. What do you want? The idea of It's interesting about how people are so quick to give me the answer, but how they change their decision later in life. My own father changed his decision about a month before he died or so, and he was in his mid 80s. He was very much the DuPont company engineer. Just get rid of me. Don't waste any time. I don't have time for this. Just cremation, cheapest thing possible. And about a month before he passed away, he says, I think we'll just do the same thing as we did for your mother. Just bury me. No fuss, no muss, no church, just you kids around. Everything's okay. And that's okay too, because at least he gave me one directive for the first 30 years. And the last month or so, he at least revisited his directive to me. And I've had other families do that. I think it's just how things change in their lives. I do think it's how they experience their demise too. I think people, when they're given those cards at the end and it's expected or anticipated death, they just start to think more about it, and they're just more firm about their decision. But that's what funeral homes are for. We're here to kind of give you all of the options. And I usually say, you don't have to make the decision right now. That's kind of my mantra. Just let me know what your thoughts are. And we can write down a few thoughts. We could revisit the thoughts. So we'll kind of definitely keep going through all of those. And then this kind of reviews on again about making your decision after you make your decision. All funeral homes, all AARP modules have things like items needed, what my 6 wishes are, my 10 wishes are. They're great documents to have, to at least handwritten out by yourselves and at least placed with your important papers. At least you've made a thought about it. I think people should self-sign their own cremation or their burial directives. Some people are very adamant. I do not want a viewing under any circumstance. Or I want to be cremated, or please give my body to science, or please give my body to University of Pennsylvania, if they can use it. And so at least there's something that's there. We already talked about Humanities Gift Registry. The last part is so important too, and I underline mailed because it's funny. A lot of people have come by the funeral home and they come pick up the folder, the arrangement folder. And I've had this with a few of my parents' friends, and then I'll get the call years later from one of the kids and say, mom or dad died. They came to see you back in 2016. Everything's taken care of. Well, they came to pick up the folder, but they never came back and signed anything. They never mailed anything to me. They never signed a directive, but they have a perfectly clean folder from 10 years ago in their directives. And then they're kind of put back into step one, like, oh my gosh, did they say anything with me? I may have started a folder on them. I may not have if I never got it back. Some funeral homes are persistent. I just simply give the information. If you're ready to do it, most people are ready when they're ready. And I understand that. This has become more and more of a topic about who really needs to know. And it's so interesting in Southern Chester County. I mean, I've lived here my whole life, but it's interesting how all communities change. I mean, I go to the grocery store and I don't recognize somebody. And I know I've recognized a lot of people over the years. That's how like big and growing some communities can be. So again, I go back to the first about, it's likely your kids and your grandkids may not be in the same town or community when you pass away. So who needs to know this is your legal next of kin. You have that conversation that sometimes isn't that comfortable, and you say to your kids, I've made my arrangements, or this is what I want, and this is where everything is. And I think that's just so important. Where are these documents? I think society is pushing this more and more. I have seen an uptick on this, though. I think people are preparing more and more. I think COVID had a lot to do with it because there was so much unexpected death, and things even weren't pushed in communities. And it didn't really get readdressed until after the pandemic really ended about, you just need to have everything kind of lined up once you reach a certain healthcare status or a certain point in your community. How do you begin? Well, I think many of you who joined tonight, you began by just getting online here, because if it didn't have an interest or a topic to you, you wouldn't have logged in. There's a lot of information folders out there from all funeral homes. We certainly can help if you're in the region and things. Things can be done online. I do like to meet in person. I think it's just important sitting across from somebody to get their feelings about certain things. We many times meet people in their own homes. I mean, I'm the only person that really likes this funeral home and the building. I understand that. And they're not comfortable in coming here quite yet, but at least it's that, or we have a conversation, or, sadly, we perfected Zoom too during COVID, because this is how most of our arrangements had to be made for almost 118 days here in Pennsylvania. Discuss it with each other. I think this group is great, that it's very direct. It's very up or down. It's very exploratory in all of the different options. And then you make your decision about how to go forward and actually putting things to paper. So that's kind of it. I'd be welcome to take in any questions you all may have.
Matthew, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation, and I have to say I felt like that you did a lot of truth telling in this presentation, which Quakers really love. So yeah, I think Lynn has some questions in the chat, and after those are exhausted, we could actually have people raise their hands too, if you want to actually vocalize your question. So
Right. Trying to move this over. So I'll just ask the questions as they were written.
Sure.
This is related to body donation, and they're asking, would you be the one my family could call to take my body to the University of PA for body donation?
Great question. So 2 avenues with that. Some people are already pre-registered with a hospital or institution for body donation. So for example, in that case, if they're already pre-registered for a full autopsy and full donation, then we make the transfer from the place of death to directly University of Penn, and what location that is given to us usually the day after. The other option is when the person is actually registered with Humanity's Gift Registry, the registry that oversees all human body donation in Pennsylvania. They're then our directive. Then they'll say, Matthew, you need to take them to Jefferson, or take them to Hahnemann, or take them to Harrisburg. So it's really about, how that was prearranged or pre-set up.
So I would say they call Humanity's Gift Registry.
Yeah. So, let me clarify that. So there are some protocols of some of the individual hospitals that will actually, if you're in a medical protocol at the end of your life, and the decision has been made to donate your brain or donate your body to science for a particular research at University of Pennsylvania, then that paperwork is always in our file well ahead of time, because that's where timeliness is so important. They want to know if the remains that were refrigerated, what time the remains have passed away, and then we take the directive directly from University of Pennsylvania in that case.
I mean, last week we were told by the Humanity Gifts Registry person that you could request to go to a particular medical school when you register with them. So
you can, and then it gets to does that school need you? So some people are very particular, and I'll tell you why. There's been professors that have been at Jefferson for 50, 60 years, and they want to go to Jefferson, and they're 95 years old, and we tell them that Dr. Smith has died. They really don't need Dr. Smith. They have more than enough cadavers right now, but they'll take him at Hahnemann. You see, so then it becomes kind of a bartering, if you will. So people's intentions are really worthy. I get it completely, and their service to those schools and hospitals. But you also have to understand they have an abundance of remains at this point because of the indigent remains, of what we're being told as well.
Another question, you had talked about when somebody dies, about having a DNR, and will a DNR prevent paramedics from trying to resuscitate if you have, that's a
necessity? That's a great question. Hospice is a great referral from me for years. unless that DNR is accessible and visible when those paramedics come in your home, under law, they have to begin resuscitation.
Mhm.
So there's been people, I have a great story. My aunt was about 90. She lived in upstate New York. She refused to go on hospice, of course, tough New Englander. And she had the DNR in the refrigerator before she went into hospice. And I remember visiting her. I'm like, what are you doing with this? You got to do this, Matthew. If you don't do this, they're gonna do all that stuff to me. And I just use that story, and it's so true. It has to be visible when they come in the house.
So put it on the fridge.
Put it on the fridge.
Not your front door.
I don't know. I agree.
Yeah. This one is another one about body donation. Last week's, and I think you alluded to this, if you donate a body, it's, used for research for up to 2 years, and then it's cremated. And you can get the ashes back if you want. And you said something about doing a green burial with such a body.
Yeah, so we had a case about a year and a half ago that they did not want to be cremated afterwards. They wanted their body buried after the anatomical registry was complete. So when the body was complete, we went to Jefferson and removed the body, brought it back to the funeral home, had it placed in a simple biodegradable container, and it was a green burial.
But isn't it embalmed or something?
It was not embalmed. No, this body was not embalmed with phenol as an anatomical body. It was not.
Huh,
Yep.
okay.
So
Well, that would explain, I was confused too.
Still met the criteria.
Okay.
Yep.
Another question about, you were explaining about how prepaying for arrangements used to be a big thing, and now it's not needed, but it wasn't clear to us why
Yeah.
it's not such a great idea now, unless people want to do it.
I used a correlation of 20 plus years ago that there was such a higher rate of ground burial, so much more merchandise was protected by inflation when things were prepaid. We live in a society today that's 60% cremation. So we don't have a casket, we don't have a burial vault, we don't have a cemetery, we don't have a headstone. And those are the items that are really being affected by inflation, those tangible merchandise items. So for direct cremation or cremation and memorial service type of arrangements, those increases have become relatively flat, 3 to 5% a year. So they're not, and we're only gaining about 2.5% in our pre-funded account. So it typically does not make a lot of sense to put monies away that are gaining 2% when you folks can be getting more than 2% from an investment group or your financial planner. The money just doesn't make sense unless you have to put the money away for Medicaid purposes, or like I said earlier, you're just adamant on prepaying all services ahead of time so nobody has to do that. Okay. Does that clarify it a little better, I hope?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so then we have Quakers typically do not do a viewing, just a memorial service, which could occur months later, not necessarily right at the time of death. If I wanted a green burial, being a Quaker, there might just be the memorial service. What steps would my spouse take to have you handle this? So
the interesting part, and again, with the green burial site that's relatively new here at Kennett Meeting, what we're seeing most of the time is that the green burial takes place within the week of the passing, and that's immediate family. If it's convenient, then the memorial service takes place the same day, just because we're on the same grounds as the locations of the auditorium and the William Penn Room. But we're seeing more, it's really weather determinative. I mean, it's not very pleasant here from November to end of February. And people have children and grandchildren, and trying to get everybody together for the memorial service and get them into town. we see much more direct burial or direct green burial first, and then the memorial service could be within a month or a couple of months. It's interesting. Once April comes, it becomes, again, respectfully, memorial services every other weekend from people that passed away from November to about March, because it's beautiful here now. I mean, it's spring is coming, and this is the time that people gather, and kids can take a break from school, and kids can come home from college for a weekend, and it just makes more sense. That's what we're seeing more of, an immediate burial of the remains, either a green burial or direct burial in a cemetery, and then the memorial service happening at another time.
Yeah. And how far away could one live to be using your particular funeral home? Somebody says
I
they
mean,
live about 45 minutes from you.
yeah,
Could they-
the world is tight. I mean, my circle is really like a 2-hour circle anymore. And I say that just because I grew up in Hockessin and Kennett Square, but we go to the Delaware beaches, we go to the Poconos, you meet people your whole lives, and then the circle just gets bigger. And that's why I say, it's almost like this 100-mile radius has been our client family base for years. My parents moved to the beach, and then so that's their new family and friends. So then they call Matthew to come get them from Fenwick Island. You know what I mean? So it just becomes this. The world is so much smaller in this sense.
Mhm. How important do you think it is to be in a certified green burial cemetery versus any cemetery that allows green burial?
Well, I think the family has to make that decision. That's tough for me to say as a practitioner. I think by educating, I've had the opportunity to, honestly, I probably educated 30 to 40 families about true green burial and the cemetery sites of traditional cemeteries that have green burial sections within them. And most all the families have selected the true traditional green burial. No, where it's, by the Green Burial Council, where it adheres to those regulations you saw on that particular slide. It had a green background. That's the true green burial. And I think if people need to waver from that, that's a personal decision, and they want to be in a green burial section in a traditional cemetery, understand that their loved one is still in a burial vault. So it's not a green burial section. So is that really worth that premium? And I say it from a fiduciary standpoint, is it really worth that premium paying?
Gary, you have your hand up.
I do. I don't want this to sound like a paid promotional announcement, but Matthew did handle the burial of my brother up here in the Green Cemetery, part of the old Kendall meeting. It just was incredibly helpful to us. I'd only gone through this with my mother's and father's death, which were decades ago. So this was some new learning for me, and I just loved the way he dealt with us and the way he handled the whole burial. It is my gold star for you, Matthew, but thank you very much for all that you did for us.
Thanks for your words. I appreciate it, Gary. Thank you.
We'll be back again.
Yes.
There's a comment in the chat that actually Kennett meeting doesn't require a vault for their green burial section.
They do not, and that's been a push. And the other part too, that even in the public, you don't have to be Quaker to be in there. And that's one, and that's kind of a myth that I've been trying to dispel. And there have been some burials. You don't have to live at Kendall. You don't have to be at Crosslands, and I think that's a great, and I'm trying to softly kind of put that out to the public. Like, this is a wonderful option in this section. And I get it's not for anyone, but everyone. But I think if people go there to visit, whether it's in the late spring all the way to the mid fall before the first frost, you get the vibe pretty quick that it's a good feel in that cemetery, and that it's true green burial, and it's a very kind of sacred and honored place. And the committee's been wonderful with consulting like the green burial guidelines, but also kind of giving their own angle to it too, their own twitch to it, that to make it very personable and very, when I really talk about, you know, the plantings, they're very involved with the plantings. Plus we have a huge deer problem. So that's something they have to deal with. But the wonderful plant selection of plantings that they've done in these sections, I think is above and beyond. And that's where I'm just a little more impartial, or a little more partial than some of these traditional cemeteries wanting to put in a green burial section just to call it a green.
Okay, Lynn, I just,
Pam
yeah,
has
why
her
don't- yeah,
hand.
she's raising her hand, and if people just want to raise their hand, because I can't figure out how to do the hand raise here.
Reactions.
It's the
Reaction,
bottom thing under reactions. Click on reactions and then, but Pam, why don't
All
you
right,
go
Pam,
ahead?
yeah.
She has her hand up.
Yep.
Okay. I was just curious, Matthew, if, you know, my first choice would be certainly the composting, human composting, but, and just out of curiosity, is it possible, assuming I can't get it done on the East Coast when the time comes, is it possible to have, at obviously great expense, no doubt, my body shipped to some place on the West Coast for that to happen, or is that not possible? Do you know?
Yeah, this is all being discussed right now. You're exactly right. So it's talking about how we're moving remains across state lines, how funeral homes are transferring remains.
Mhm.
Again, these are other myths too. You do not have to be embalmed to be moved across state lines by automobile. The embalming requirement is when we're moving your body by airline, unless it's for religious purposes. And then if it's for religious purposes, then your body is encased in a metal container that's hermetically sealed, that's appropriate and permitted by the airlines. So what you're asking is, you know, hypothetically, we remove your body from wherever you're at. We negotiate with a composting facility, let's say in New York State. We transfer your remains to that facility, and that funeral home will then compost you. That is the whole, that's kind of like the real kicker right now about how we're doing the death certificate, you see? Because if you pass away, say you pass away in Delaware and we have a place in New York State that will compost you, who's signing the death certificate? Am I signing it as a Delaware licensee with the composting facility in New York State? And then what is he signing? Is he signing the disposition permit, or is he signing the death certificate? But he's not licensed in Delaware. So it becomes a very licensure thing back and forth about human remains.
Mhm.
That's why, you know, particularly if you ever had the situation where you had to have two funeral homes involved, where someone passes away somewhere and then they're disposed of in another location, there's reciprocity involved with having the death certificate signed and then the other funeral home taking care of the ground burial. So the real thing, the real kind of stickler in the legislation right now in all of these states is that how are they moving remains unless they pass away in that state? Because are they calling it the composting, the final disposition? Or are they calling the receiving funeral home the final disposition of this of the remains? And I think it's still yet to be done.
Mhm.
But as you know, money helps with all these things. I mean, anything could probably happen, you know?
Okay, so I figure that'll never happen for me because the way of legislatures and stuff moves so slowly. But so I'll be going for the green burial.
Rich,
Sure. Matthew, I really have enjoyed your presentation. I really like your attitude. Now, is there some associations of or association of funeral directors who might have a more modern, like yours, attitude toward disposition?
I think the National Funeral Directors Association, which is the parent group for all funeral homes in the country, I mean, they're forced to have to hear all of these different views. I think the regional associations do very well. I do. When I gave you my stake earlier on how many funeral homes in Pennsylvania, they just can't get on the same page for anything other than rainwater. Um, And it's a shame because this is a topic that everybody, if it was educated properly, I think could help each other. But I think it's so generationally done in this profession for the most part. I mean, for me to do what I've done for 30 years, starting a funeral home from scratch, and it's not my parents or grandparents, but I've worked for enough family-owned places where the poor grandson can't even, go get the car washed without asking anything. I think there's some collaborative needs. I think regionally, I go back to that because this southeastern portion of Pennsylvania, there's some great funeral homes, and everybody's kind of like-minded in the sense of this is the reality of things. And there are these new ideas of composting that they're going to roll their eyes at, or direct burial or direct disposition that they roll their eyes at, but it's here. And these are the same funeral directors that never thought we'd be 60% cremation in this region, because they just kept thinking everyone was going to buy a casket and everything was going to go into the ground. So to answer your question, I think it's, you got to be warm and fuzzy with your funeral, and everybody kind of knows a funeral home. I get it. It's a regional thing where you kind of end up late in life or who you've always dealt with. But things change. I mean, some funeral homes can have radically changed to be more progressive. Some have stayed in the same lane that at least I've known them for 30, 35 years.
I have a question, I realized. My son's partner died last summer, and he used a funeral home in Philadelphia, and like when you described the viewing with the sheet up to the chin, that's what they did. They provide a grief group like once a month, I think. And I didn't know how common it was that funeral homes were able to offer anything like that. I mean, I know a funeral director obviously does a lot of work with people who are grieving deeply, but is it common that a funeral home would offer
Great
that?
question. I think you have to kind of think of, we're using the name funeral home in totality. I mean, the size of funeral homes have to really be considered first.
Right.
Pennsylvania has the most funeral homes per capita in the country, but most of them are doing between 15 and 35 funerals a year, because you get into central Pennsylvania, it's so wonderfully rural, right? They have 3 funeral homes in a little small town of 1,000 people, and they all do 15 funerals a year. You get into larger funeral homes, I'm saying like over 100 funerals a year, most of that size have a real organized grief group or grief workshop within their structure itself. Whether we're doing it in tandem with other locations, whether they're church groups, non-denominational groups, or service organizations, with truly organized social workers, that come in and do programs. We've done a program for years, in the spring and at Christmas time about remembering people and also pre-planning. I think those types of things help. I think aftercare, in my experience, can also be touchy because, you have to really know the aspects of licensed grief work versus someone just understanding and listening to you, because someone could be in serious trouble after someone passes away. And to have the right licensed person across from them, I think is very important. I can empathize with a lot of situations. I don't know what it's like to bury a child. I do know what it's like to bury parents and a sibling and people our age, but so how can I sit across from a mother and father and really understand what they're feeling? I can't. I can tell them I've buried a lot of kids. I've made those calls and such. But I think it's really calling the funeral home to ask them, do they recommend anybody? We all have our favorites. We have our favorite chaplains that we like to use at times. We have our favorite grief counselors. And I think there's certain groups that are better for others. I'm always very touchy, though, when churches get overly involved, denominational churches get overly involved with grief, because if they're not a member of that church, people aren't ready to go to that church. And I think sometimes some denominations overreach their boundaries in things like that, even though a grief group can be very good, or I heard good things about them. Sometimes people don't need to hear about the God thing afterwards. And I think some of them are geared towards that. at times from the feedback that I get.
Okay.
Hey, are there any other questions? Any other folks want to raise their hand? Then what I'd say, Matthew, do you want to say anything else before we finish the recording?
I just thank you so much for including me. It's been another great night. I see some new faces and a few old ones, and thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank
Uh,
you, Matthew.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It has
Fun.
been a real pleasure having you on, and
Thank
thank you.
you.
I've learned a lot. I tell you what, we can stop the recording now, and I'd ask, Chris and Lynn and Beth, who are the organizers of this, and Matthew, just stay on for a few
Please do.
minutes
Yes.
after everybody